In the beginning of the story, a man suddenly notices something very strange. The container truck standing in front of him was clearly way heavier than necessary, but as soon as the container was opened, nothing was visible inside. The bald officer thought that maybe there was a problem with the weighing machine, so he moved forward himself and began inspecting the container carefully. He checked the entire container, but couldn't spot anything unusual. However, the driver's panicked eyes said it all. It was obvious he was hiding something. Now the bald officer also grew suspicious. He walked outside and began examining the container closely from the exterior. That's when he realized that the outer length of the container was slightly longer than the space inside. This meant there was definitely a secret compartment hidden somewhere within. To confirm his suspicions, he ordered his men to shoot from the innermost section of the container outward. The bullet went straight through and exited from the middle exterior section of the container. Now everything was crystal clear. A secret hidden space had indeed been built into the back of the container. Seeing this, the bald officer flew into a rage, feeling as though someone had played him for a fool. He rushed straight to the back of the container. Meanwhile, the refugees hiding inside were terrified. They knew how ruthless the army here was. If anyone was caught trying to cross the border illegally, their chances of survival were slim to none. Everyone assumed they were about to be executed. But suddenly, the bald officer completely shifted his tone. With a subtle smile, he said, "I've always trusted you people. I'm here to help you." Hearing his voice, it almost sounded as if he genuinely wanted to save them. Yet none of the hidden refugees stepped out. Gradually, his patience began to wear thin. He was just about to order his men to open fire when suddenly, a girl with blonde hair opened the heavy iron door and stepped out. Upon seeing her, the bald officer signaled his soldiers to lower their weapons. He then walked up to the girl with a smile and spoke in a friendly tone, reassuring her that he was there to help. Hearing this, a spark of hope lit up in the girl's eyes. She believed that her life was finally saved. But in the very next second, without hesitating for even a moment, the bald officer pulled the trigger. The girl's eyes widened in utter shock as she collapsed onto the ground, soaked in blood. Even in her final moments, she couldn't comprehend what had just happened to her. Right after, the bald officer issued a cold command, and horrifying screams echoed from inside the container. Within moments, everyone inside lay dead in a pool of blood. Not a single person survived, except for one woman. She was hiding on top of some wooden crates, holding her mouth tightly with both hands so that not even the faintest whisper could escape. Deep down, she had only one silent prayer: for this nightmare to end as quickly as possible. Suddenly, she felt the footsteps of the bald officer approaching her hiding spot. Paralyzed by fear, she pressed her hands over her mouth even tighter, terrified that the slightest sound would cost her life. Just as the officer was about to reach her, a dog unexpectedly came running into the container. The moment the officer saw the dog, the expression on his face completely transformed. The man who had seemed utterly ruthless just seconds ago now appeared completely calm and gentle. He cast a quick glance around and began walking away. But then he heard the faint sound of a little baby crying behind him. His expression instantly froze back into coldness. He turned to his men and commanded, "Clean everything up here and collect all their belongings." Following his orders, the soldiers went straight to work. They dragged out the bodies one by one and thoroughly washed away the blood spilled inside the container. It was cleaned so meticulously that it looked as if nothing had ever happened there. Slowly, the heavy container doors swung shut, bringing that terrifying incident to a close. Once the woman was completely sure that the sound of the soldiers' fading footsteps had disappeared, she took her hands off her mouth and broke down in tears. She was relieved to be alive, but she knew that a massive struggle lay ahead. She had thought her ordeal was over, but her true nightmare was only just beginning. A short while later, the container was loaded onto a massive cargo ship. Sitting alone inside, the woman placed her hand over her belly, thinking about her unborn child. She made a firm resolve in her heart. No matter what happened, she had to stay alive for her baby. Immersed in these thoughts, she eventually fell asleep in the dark. Suddenly, the ship began to rock violently. Violent jolts snapped her wide awake. Outside, a ferocious storm had broken out, with massive ocean waves slamming repeatedly against the ship. Desperate to save herself, she began screaming for help with all her strength, but her voice was drowned out and reached no one. Then a colossal wave overturned the ship. The container she was trapped in was thrown off the ship and plunged straight into the raging ocean. The woman kept screaming for help, but her voice was completely lost in the roar of the sea. Slowly, darkness began to creep over her vision. When she finally regained consciousness, an uncanny silence surrounded her, broken only by the sound of ocean waves. The first thing she did was check her belly. Fortunately, her baby was safe. She dragged herself up with great effort and peeked through the bullet hole in the container. What she saw outside left her completely stunned. She was floating all alone in the middle of the open sea. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but endless water. To her astonishment, several other containers were also floating nearby in the ocean. For a moment, she couldn't even process what had happened to her. In a panic, she pulled out her phone to call for help, but it had been smashed and broken during the storm. Luckily, she had a second phone, but a new problem arose. She couldn't remember the password. As she desperately tried to recall the code, a sharp, excruciating pain shot through her stomach. She realized that the violent jolts must have affected her pregnancy and her delivery time was drawing near, all while she was stranded in the middle of nowhere. As if that wasn't enough, water had started seeping into the container through the bullet hole. If she didn't do something quickly, the container would sink, taking her last hope of survival down with it. Enduring the pain, she began searching through the items inside the container, hoping to find anything useful. However, most of the cargo consisted of useless items, some TVs and clothing. It felt as though no way out remained. Yet she didn't realize that these very items would later play a crucial role in saving her life. Suddenly, her eyes caught a roll of tape lying on the floor, and hope flickered back into her eyes. She quickly picked up the tape and sealed the bullet hole. Although the water didn't stop completely, the leak was significantly reduced, giving her a brief moment of relief. Suddenly, she heard distant screams coming from outside. Looking out, she saw other people stranded on top of a nearby floating container. They had somehow survived the initial military check, but their container was far too heavy and was now slowly sinking. The woman screamed with all her strength, "Don't give up! Hang on!" Yet deep down, she knew there was nothing she could do to help them. Within moments, the heavy container plunged completely beneath the waves, taking everyone on board down into the depths. Watching this sent a wave of terror through her, as she realized that the very same fate might await her soon. Then another sharp pain gripped her stomach. Stroking her belly, her mind drifted to her husband. He was hidden inside a different container, and though both were desperately worried for each other, they had no way to communicate. She didn't even know if he was still alive or dead. Now the baby growing inside her was her sole reason to keep breathing. Clinging to that thought, she drifted back to sleep. But after some time, an intense cold woke her up. Looking down, horror washed over her. The entire container was filling up with water. Her feet were already submerged. In just one night, the container had gradually begun to sink deeper. If she didn't bail the water out fast, she would meet the same tragic fate as the people she had just watched drown. She looked around frantically and noticed another container suspended right above hers. With immense effort, she managed to open its latch, hoping to find something useful inside. But when she opened it, her heart sank. It was filled with nothing but plastic food containers. She stood frozen in disappointment for a moment, until her eyes caught the thin rubber sealing bands attached to the lids. Seeing the rubber bands triggered an idea. Using those bands in plastic containers, she rigged together a crude water bailing system. First, she stacked all the heavy wooden crates onto one side of the container. This tilted the containers slightly, causing the accumulated water to pool into one corner. Then, using her makeshift tool, she began scooping and draining the water out. After exhausting labor, she managed to clear out a significant amount of water. For the time being, however, for a person stranded alone at sea, these supplies were nowhere near enough. As she sat pondering her next move, another agonizing contraction struck her abdomen. She realized the time had finally come to give birth. Outside, thunder roared across the sky, while inside, she writhed in intense pain. With every contraction, it felt as though her body was tearing apart, but she refused to surrender. She endured the grueling pain till, with one final agonizing cry, she brought her baby into the world. Against all odds, the newborn baby was healthy, but the mother was completely drained and exhausted. While seeing her child brought immense joy, a grim reality stared her in the face. She had no food, no proper water supply, and couldn't even produce milk to feed her baby. The infant cried continuously. She tried everything to soothe her, cradling and rocking her in her arms, but the baby wouldn't stop crying. At times, overwhelming despair caused her to break down and scream in frustration, but a moment later, filled with guilt, she would pull her child close to her chest and weep softly. Her physical strength was rapidly deteriorating. To survive, she had to make an agonizingly difficult choice. She consumed the remaining placenta from the birth to give her body a desperately needed boost of energy. It provided a small surge of strength, but she knew it wouldn't last long. She desperately needed to secure fresh food and water. That's when her eyes fell upon an electric drill lying among the cargo. She immediately grabbed it and began drilling into the heavy iron roof of the container, hoping to carve out an escape hatch. But halfway through the task, The drill sputtered and died. The battery was completely drained. With the drill dead, her hopes plunged once again. Cutting through such thick iron plates with her bare hands was impossible. To make matters worse, her remaining fresh water supply was running out, while hunger and weakness grew more unbearable by the hour. In a fit of rage and helplessness, she began throwing cargo around the container. During her outburst, she stumbled upon a multi-tool file. A faint glimmer of hope sparkled again, though she quickly realized that filing through thick iron would be a painfully slow process. As time dragged on, darkness crept over her vision once more. By nightfall, she turned back to what remained of the placenta, eating a bit more to summon whatever energy she could. Suddenly, a strange sound echoed from outside. Frightened, she tiptoed over to the bullet hole and peeked out. Before she could process what was happening, a massive tail slammed hard against the container. Boom! The entire container shuddered violently, startling the baby awake. The mother quickly pulled her child close, grabbed a heavy wooden stick, and began banging frantically on the container walls, shouting to scare the creature away. Looking out carefully, she was left speechless. It was a giant whale. The whale hovered near the container for a short while before slowly gliding back into the dark ocean depths. As days passed, water kept trickling back into the container, and to make things worse, her metal file snapped. Her remaining hope began to fade away. Even though she had taped the bullet hole, seawater steadily seeped in. Hunger and dehydration slowly drained her ability to think clearly. Suddenly, her gaze fell onto the seawater pooled at the bottom of the container. She scooped some into a bottle and stared at it, locked in an internal battle, to drink or not to drink. She knew drinking salt water was dangerous, and ultimately, she restrained herself. Instead of drinking it, she poured the cold seawater over her head to keep herself conscious. That's when she noticed small drops of condensation dripping from the iron ceiling. She rushed over and began licking the droplets off the metal with her tongue. Realizing a few drops wouldn't quench her thirst, she began collecting them carefully into a bottle. However, the collected water tasted heavily of rust. Shortly after swallowing it, she was overcome by severe nausea and began vomiting. Her condition deteriorated even further, and she felt as though she wouldn't survive much longer. But then, cold raindrops splashed onto her face. She slowly opened her eyes and realized it was raining outside. Rainwater was pouring through the hole she had drilled earlier in the ceiling. Seeing this, hope flooded back into her heart. She immediately stood up and began drinking the pure rainwater. For the first time in days, she had access to clean, cold water. As it trickled down her throat, it felt as if life itself was returning to her body. After drinking her fill, she quickly gathered the plastic containers and began collecting as much rainwater as possible, knowing this water would be the key to their survival. Seeing the abundance of rainwater reignited her will to live. She hastily gathered every plastic box in the container to catch the downpour, not even leaving behind a small empty tin can lying on the floor. Just then, an idea struck her. She recalled how the electric drill had stopped halfway through cutting the ceiling plate before its battery died. Looking at the empty tin can, a clever solution formed in her mind, and a surge of determination filled her once again. After laying her baby down safely, she got to work. She took a long, strong strap, tied it securely to one corner of the partially cut iron sheet, and wrapped the other end tightly around her hands. Then, leaning back with all her body weight, she pulled on the strap with everything she had, just like pulling open the tab on a beverage can. She poured every ounce of her strength into saving her baby. Her hands were raw and bleeding, and her body was at its absolute limit, but she refused to let go. Finally, after a grueling struggle, the heavy iron sheet tore open. Sunlight poured into the dark container. For the first time in days, warm sunlight touched her and her baby's faces. In that moment, it felt as though light had finally broken through the darkness. But when she managed to haul herself out onto the top of the container, her heart sank once more. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but endless, desolate ocean. No land, no ships, no people. Just vast water and eerie silence. The container floating in the infinite sea looked like nothing more than a tiny speck of dust. After enduring so much suffering, a wave of despair washed over her, making her want to give up. But then she looked down at her innocent child sleeping peacefully beside her. Seeing her baby restored her strength. She reminded herself that she couldn't give up. Her daughter hadn't even seen the world yet, and she had to survive no matter what. Sometime later, she changed her baby's diaper and tossed the used one into the sea. Suddenly, something remarkable happened. Small fish began swimming toward the floating diaper. Seeing this, the woman's eyes lit up with excitement. She joyfully tried calling the fish over, but quickly realized they wouldn't just jump into her hands. If she wanted food, she had to hunt. She climbed back inside the container, scavenged a few metal screws and sharp parts, and crafted a primitive makeshift spear. She began trying to spear the fish, but it proved far harder than expected. Once, twice, 10 times, 15 times. She struck repeatedly, but failed to catch a single fish. Instead, her remaining physical energy was completely drained. Exhausted, she collapsed onto the top of the container. Severe hunger pangs twisted her stomach, making her feel violently ill, and she was on the verge of surrendering to fate. When suddenly a loud roar echoed from above. She looked up at the sky, her eyes wide with shock. A plane was flying directly overhead.